Hello, this is currently being recorded in a hotel room in Bali, but I wanted to try and get it out because it's been a really useful experience being out here to try and learn a bit about color grading. I mean, everything I've learned in terms of color grading has come through kind of word of mouth or YouTube videos, but one of the big things that I always find on YouTube videos is that they're always trying to flog you their own LUT, their own color pack, and I want to be able to show you guys how you can do a color edit and how you can do a color grade without spending a penny, except for buying Final Cut, which is really expensive. So to start with, we're going to jump straight into Final Cut, but I know that you can do similar stuff with DaVinci Resolve and Premiere, but everything I do goes through Final Cut. So if we jump straight into this project that I have already set up, what I've done here is I've imported different video clips. They're totally unrelated, but they're from different cameras. So we've got here a bit from a GoPro, a bit from a knockoff GoPro that we bought out here that is perfectly adequate but is a little bit cheaper. Stuff from the DJI Mini 3 Pro, a little bit from the A7 IV, a little bit from the A7 III, and a little bit more from the A7 IV. We're going to try and go through this kind of bit by bit. I'm going to show you how to do basic color tweaks, but then also how to apply a LUT on top of everything to kind of make everything come together into a cohesive block. So first things first, if we start with the easiest bits, which is the GoPro. So because the GoPro just shoots in MP4 or .mov, the color grade is pretty minimal. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my color corrections, and for this I've got my scopes set up over here, which is my Luma scopes, or you can use your RGB overlay. The RGB overlay just gives you more information and it can be more helpful when it comes to the color grade. And then up here you've got your vector scope, and the vector scope can be really helpful to see how oversaturated, desaturated it is, but also whether or not your skin tones are correct. So if we go over to our first clip, which is just me swimming off the GoPro, we can see that we've got a lot of information. Anything over this 100 mark is overexposed, you're losing information there, and anything below the 0 mark is clipped. So we've got too much information in the darks. So your color corrections are basically trying to bring everything between 0 and 100. I always use color wheels because they are a little bit more logical, but we're just going to bring up our shadows until the very bottom of them is just touching the 0 mark. And then similarly with the highlights, we're going to bring our highlights down until the top of them is just touching the 100 mark. From here we can see that it's fairly well saturated. The colors don't need to be tweaked too much. This is personal preference. Generally, if I'm going to increase the saturation, I might do a little bit within the midtones and the highlights. So I might bring the highlights up a touch, and I might bring the midtones up a touch. And more or less, that's your first kind of clip. And if we compare it to the second one, we can do a similar thing here. We've got lots of information. It's actually quite well exposed. So we can just bring our highlights up again and our shadows down to spread that information. And the midtones basically spreads the information that you've got within that range. So by bringing our midtones up, you can see that that RGB overlay starts to get pushed upwards, and vice versa when we go down. But to be honest, that's pretty good. I've already brought a bit of saturation into the midtones, so that clip is kind of done. It doesn't give you a huge amount of power within the GoPro because it wants to be quick and easy. This is off the knockoff GoPro brand, and you can kind of see that in terms of noise, it's quite a noisy image, but it is fairly well exposed. So if we select that clip and we just bring our shadows up a touch until they're at the 0, and we just push our highlights up to 100, that's fairly well exposed, but you can see that because the image quality is a bit lower, we're starting to get a little bit of noise in the shadows, and that is just the sensor size, to be honest. So I might bring back the shadows a little tiny bit so that hides the noise. But in terms of saturation, I'm fairly happy with how that looks. The DJI clips I shoot in something called DLog. which is DJI's equivalent to DLog. So it's a color profile that has a little bit more information within it, which means that you can save the shadows and you can bring back the highlights a little bit more than if you shoot in just MP4 or the standard and you let the DJI drone do most of the work. So I'd really recommend, if you do use a drone, that you shoot in D-Cinelike, and that will help you just have a little bit more control over what you're doing with your editing process. So this clip then, this was a sunset, so we've got some extreme highlights and we've also got some extreme shadows in this silhouette. And we can see that kind of replicated within the RGB overlay, within the scopes. The information's already been clipped here. So even by bringing back my highlights, I can't save the information that I've got here. So I'm just going to push everything up to as close to 100 as I can. And I'm going to bring my shadows down to 0. And I might just spread the midtones a little tiny bit. Actually, to be honest, it looks a bit nicer when it's silhouetted like that. And then finally, the thing that I do find with D-Cinelike is that it is incredibly desaturated. So I bump up the saturation within that, and that is more or less what I'm after. Okay, so this clip again, this was taken on Mount Papandayan, so it's very flat. Again, it's shot in D-Cinelike, same rules apply. This time, however, I'm going to show you how to do it using curves. So instead of using these color wheels, instead I'm going to go to color curves. From here, you can see that this curve, we've got everything from the true black to the true whites. And by bringing my little dot across the bottom of the screen, we're pushing those shadows right down. So things that are black should be black. On the other end of our curve, we're going to just drag it back, which will bring our highlights up. And we're going to go as far as they start to touch the top. Okay, so now we've got true black and true whites all in the right place. From here, you can make our standard S-curve. But it still looks incredibly flat. So we're going to go back to our color wheels, and we're going to start to bring in some color into the midtones and into the highlights. Okay, so we're happy there. Final one of the DJI clips then. This time I'll do the same thing again. I'm going to go through color curves, bring the blacks down to the black, the whites up to the whites, add in a little bit of contrast with my S-curve, and then I'm going to bring in some color. Brilliant. So if we go back, we can see what the clip looked like before and what it looks like afterwards. Brilliant. So 3 very different clips, very different compositions, and lots of different light. But you can see how a little bit of tweaking and a little bit of moving just spreads that information that you get across the whole clip. Okay, so now we're going to come on to the professional cameras, the DSLRs. DSLRs give you a lot more options in terms of shooting style. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about those at the moment, but the number one thing that I would recommend, and it's something that I haven't got onto until quite late in the game, is shooting in DLog. So DLog is the equivalent for videographers as RAW is for photographers. So if we shoot in RAW and we export a file from the camera, the image looks flat, it looks desaturated, but the image contains a lot of information that you can save in post. And the same thing is with DLog. When you export a file from your camera in DLog, the image looks flat, desaturated, but it still is there, the information is there. You've got more information in the highlights and more information in the shadows. We just have to know how to find it. So the first thing you need to be able to do when you bring in your DLog footage is convert it. So you need what's called an S-log. So that is what changes your DLog image into a standard file. And these are free online. You can find conversion LUTs for all of your camera types. So the Sony one might be different to the Canon one, which might be different to the Lumix one. So all you need to do is Google, in my case, Sony S-log 3 conversion LUT. And then it'll download a file and you have to import that into Final Cut. I'm not going to go into all of that, but there are YouTube videos to that. So in this clip, I want to first of all convert this clip into a usable file, into a usable image. So I'm going to add my conversion LUT. And to do that, I'm going to go over here, type in custom LUT. Drag my custom LUT over the top of this clip, and you'll see that it's been added up here. So from the drop-down menu, I've got my Sony S-log to Rec 709 LUT. If I click on that, you'll see immediately the color comes back. We can see a little bit more of what we're working with. Excellent. Even here though, we can see we've got a lot of information in the shadows, not much information in the highlights. And so to make this image a little bit more user-friendly, a little bit more usable, we can start to play around with the color within this image. Final Cut works top down. So whether that is within your timeline, the thing that is at the top of the timeline will be red first, will appear on top of your timeline, but also within any effects that you apply, it'll work from the top down. So if we want to bring our highlights down, for example, we can drop our highlights here. What it appears to be doing is just darkening the whole image, making the whole image turn gray. And the reason that is because that effect is being applied below that custom LUT. So what we need to do is move that color wheel, that color edit, to above the custom LUT so that it reads that edit first. Looking at our RGB overlay, that there's now no information in the highlights. So we can start to play around with those edits, making sure that we've got good color in the blacks, and we're just spreading that information through. Brilliant. So it's really important that your color wheels, your color curves, or any of those color corrections come above your conversion LUT. This one, we're going to do the same thing, but I am going to do less talking. Okay, so in this clip we can see that actually the reds are far too high. You can look in this highlight area and you can see that the reds are much too high. So when we go to our color editor this time, we're going to start by pushing up our highlights a little bit. Remember that at the moment, Final Cut is adding this below the LUT, so we're going to move that above the custom LUT. Okay, it still looks very red. We can see here that there's a lot of information within the highlights, whereas the shadows, there's a lot of blues there. So if we go back to that color wheel, and we go to the highlights section, we can start to drag down into the blue area, and what you'll see is as you move your dot around the color wheel, you'll see that the color, the RGB, starts to line up into a solid white line, and that is the correct exposure. So that's your white balance sorted. But having said that, you can see that here it looks a bit washed out. It doesn't look the same as the previous clip. So it comes down to personal preference. There's probably a little bit too much teal in there, so we can just bring in a little bit of red until it looks about right. I'm happier with that. So there's quite a lot of blue down here. So if we go to the shadows, we can bring a little bit of red into the shadows as well. Just warm them up. Okay. So that clip is now edited. We're happy with that one. Two more clips to look at. Now the last two clips have got faces in them, which means we need to pay more attention to skin tone. So the same thing applies. First things first, we're going to apply our custom LUT. Now what you can do if you want to is do all of your edits and then apply your custom LUT. But to be honest, if you do that, then the image might look totally different when you apply the LUT. So you could tweak your highlights and your contrast and your colors without applying that conversion LUT and then do it at the end. But for my workflow, I find it easiest to see what the image looks like once you put it through a conversion LUT and then add your color corrections after that. So now we need to start looking at skin tones. So skin tones are what make your image look correct, that your characters, your subjects don't look sickly or orange, and the way that you can do this is by applying a mask over a small part of the image. So if I type in mask, draw a mask over this, and I'm just going to do a small square around her cheek. Okay, we can see that at the moment the only thing that the clip is looking at is that small part of the clip, and if we look over here into our vector scope, you can see that the information that is being displayed roughly lines up with this line, which is your skin tone line. And what you can do is by using your color wheels, you can I use the global one, you can move color wheel around until your skin tones line up with that skin tone line. After that, we can go back to our draw mask and remove that. Now our skin tones are correctly exposed. And then we just carry on with the same stuff we've done. So we bring our shadows up, our highlights down, and our midtones we can move around as well. That is a correctly exposed image. She looks the correct colors, the leaves all look the correct colors. Done, happy days. On to our final clip. So this one is a little bit darker, it was shot inside. We can see that most of the information within here is contained within the shadows and midtones area. We haven't got anything in the highlights. So first things first, let's do our custom LUT. Right, so we're going to add our custom conversion LUT. He looks pretty red, so we're going to have to change some things around here. So first things first, let's spread the information where we want it to be spread. You can see that there's a lot of red in the highlights and actually a lot of green as well coming from his green shirt. So we're going to use our highlights wheel and just bring that in circles until those lines roughly line up. The character here looks quite pale, looks quite washed out. So we're going to color in our mask on his face. Okay, and you can see looking at the vector scope that actually there's too much red and there's not enough yellow in there. So we're going to go back to our color wheel and we're going to bring down, there we go. And hopefully when we turn off that mask, we'll be able to see a correct exposure. Now, in my opinion, he still looks a bit washed out. He still looks a bit pale. So we can come back in here. We know that the skin tones are correct. So from here, we can just bring a little bit more, maybe back into the highlights. Maybe add a little bit more red and orange in there. So finally, those look more or less correctly exposed and we're happy. Now, it's very time consuming doing all of your color corrections in one go, but it is a necessary part. Otherwise, you just shoot in DLog and it looks flat and unfinished. So you need to do your color corrections in order to draw everything together. Now there is one more aspect of this whole thing that can help you make sure your clips look correct. Make sure they all are held together underneath one banner, so to speak. And this is the same thing as applying a LUT or a preset to your images in Photoshop. And this is what you see all the time within, videographers on YouTube is, buy my LUTs, buy my LUTs, buy my presets. But to be honest, you can make your own and it's not too stressful. The first thing you need to bear in mind, and the first thing you need to download is a free, and I don't know why they don't come standard within Final Cut, but is a free adjustment layer. So an adjustment layer basically means that everything underneath that adjustment layer is affected by what you're adding to it. So I'll show you what I mean. I've only got a 24 FPS adjustment layer here, but I'm going to drag it on top of my clips. Okay, and I'm going to drag it all the way along. And if I select that adjustment layer, and I don't know, let's do something daft, and I bump up the saturation, you'll see that my playhead is underneath there, but despite that, all of my clips are now vastly oversaturated. So the adjustment layer is really powerful and can mean that you can make global edits to your project without having to go through individual clips. So let's bring that back, let's get rid of that. And this is the easiest bit because your adjustment layer is what can hold everything together. So for me, I'm going to do a very small, very basic LUT. I'm going to create a LUT. And that is purely by adding a little bit of green into my clips. Maybe bring down the shadows a little bit so they're a little bit darker and a bit moodier. And what you'll see is that when you add your LUT, your color correction onto that top adjustment layer, it adds it to everything, and so it kind of unifies the clip that you've produced, the video that you've produced. It all looks the same. Within cinematography, within big label video shoots, they tend to add a bit more green. That kind of enhances the cinema feel of a clip. Another favorite is to add a little bit of orange and teal. These two juxtaposed colors can make for really interesting clips. So in order to do that, what we can do is we can add a color wheel and we could bring the shadows into the oranges and we could bring the highlights into the teals. And that just brings a bit of uniform color to your clips. It holds it all together. It acts like a transition between clips, even if they were shot on different cameras. And the really interesting thing about having done those is that you can actually save those effects. You can do that by clicking on Save Effects Preset, and maybe in this time I'll call this orange and teal. So I'm going to save that within my LUTs. And now in future, so if we go back to that clip and we turn off delete that, let me delete that. In future, if I want to go to my previously created LUT that I haven't paid any money for, you can go down to LUTs and we can import things that we've done previously. So I've labeled one green haze, and now I have all of my clips all looking uniform, all using that same preset, that same LUT. That is my process when it comes to color corrections and color editing. It can be quite long-winded, but it takes a bit of time and finessing. And then once you've got it nailed down, you can do it over and over again and you can cruise through it super quick. So hopefully that was useful. Hopefully that was informative. And if you've got any questions, you can either drop a message in the comments or message me directly and I'll do my best to help. I'd also like to know what kind of videos would be useful. I love editing, and so I don't mind making Final Cut tutorial videos, but I don't really know where to start. So any pointers, and I'm here to help. Cool, thanks, bye.